Welcome to Curiosidad Global. This is a true-to-life story of how justice doesn't always come from loud words or clever arguments, but from the quiet, brave gestures of a child. Subscribe to Curiosidad Global to follow the full story, chapter by chapter. Comment below, from which city are you watching this story? And tell us, would you have noticed what the judge did? The courtroom buzzed with tension. People whispered behind cupped hands as Melissa entered in a pressed navy dress, holding Julie and Meg gently by their hands. The girls looked small beside her. Julie was 8, Meg only 5, and they seemed too quiet for children their age. Melissa carried herself with poise. Her long, wavy hair was pulled into a low bun, and she wore minimal makeup, just enough to make her look professional, composed. To anyone watching, she appeared the image of a loving, responsible mother. Paul stood on the other side of the courtroom, stiff in a gray suit that didn't quite fit right. His jaw clenched each time he looked at Melissa. He didn't smile at the girls. He looked determined. This was the final hearing in what had become a brutal custody battle. Paul claimed Melissa was unfit to raise the girls. He'd cited neglect, emotional manipulation, even hinted at physical punishment. But he lacked concrete proof. Melissa's defense team was good, very good, and had painted Paul as jealous, controlling, and vindictive. And truthfully, the judge, Ms. Beatrice Langston, had begun to lean toward Melissa's side. The evidence was heavily circumstantial. Melissa had no criminal record. Her home was well kept. The girls were always clean and well fed. Report cards from Julie's school showed good behavior and decent grades. No red flags, at least not on paper. Your Honor, Melissa's attorney began as the hearing commenced, we understand Mr. Brackett's emotional concern for his daughters, but we urge the court to focus on facts rather than frustration. Beatrice Langston gave a small nod. She was in her early 60s, composed, and highly experienced. She had seen the worst of humanity pass through her courtroom, and the best. Her reputation was that of calm fairness, even in chaos. Melissa took the stand and told her story, how Paul had become emotionally distant, how she'd been the one to stay up with the girls at night, help them with homework, take them to every doctor's appointment. I have never laid a hand on my children, she said firmly. They are my world. Her voice quivered just slightly at the end of that sentence, enough to move people in the room. Her attorney reached out and squeezed her hand. Some in the gallery even nodded in sympathy. Julie and Meg sat on the bench, their hands resting on their laps. They didn't fidget. They didn't giggle. They were far too quiet for little girls in such a setting. And Beatrice noticed that too. Paul's attorney was less polished but spoke with a kind of rawness that felt real. Your Honor, he began, my client is not seeking custody out of revenge. He is seeking custody because he's afraid. He believes his daughters are not safe. And while he may not have bruises to show you, or video evidence, he has truth. And the truth is often whispered, not shouted. Paul was called to the stand next. He was not eloquent like Melissa. He stumbled through the beginning, struggling to find his words. I know I wasn't the perfect husband. I worked too much. I traveled too often. But I always made time for the girls. I never stopped loving them. He looked across the room at them, and for a second, his voice broke. I left because of how Melissa changed, he continued. It started small, losing her temper, locking herself in her room, making the girls do all the cleaning. Then the yelling. Then. He hesitated. I can't prove she's hurting them, but I can feel it. I know my daughters, Your Honor. I know when they're afraid. Melissa scoffed quietly. The judge glanced at her but said nothing. Julie doesn't talk to me anymore, Paul said. She's been told I abandoned them. I didn't. I filed for joint custody right after the divorce. But I haven't had a full weekend alone with them in over a year. His lawyer submitted text messages and email exchanges, Melissa refusing visitation dates, canceling last minute, accusing him of irresponsibility whenever he asked to see the girls. Still, it wasn't enough. The judge leaned back in her chair. She'd seen dozens of cases like this, bitter exes playing tug-of-war with children in the middle. Usually, the truth was somewhere in the messy gray area between both stories. Melissa returned to the stand to respond. She did so with elegance. I never denied him visits. I just didn't want to disrupt the girls' routine. They cry every time they come back from his apartment. I can't pretend that's healthy. As she spoke, Meg shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was subtle, just a wriggle of her shoulders. But Judge Langston noticed. The judge turned her attention to the child. Would you be willing to speak with me, Meg? Just the two of us. Very briefly. Melissa looked alarmed, but nodded. Of course. If she wants to. Meg's small hand squeezed the stuffed bear tighter. She stood slowly, glancing up at her mother, then down at the floor. Paul turned his face away, as if afraid to hope. Inside the judge's private chamber, Beatrice sat with Meg alone. No lawyers. No bailiffs. Just the two of them. Beatrice smiled softly. I'm not here to scare you, Meg. I just want to know how you're doing. Do you like school? Meg nodded once. And your sister? Another nod. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. And how do you feel when you're with Mommy? There it was again, that flicker in the child's eyes. A flash of something dark and restrained. Then she glanced toward the sleeve of her arm, almost unconsciously. Beatrice's gaze followed. The edge of a yellowish bruise peeked out under the soft cotton. That was all she needed to see. Meg didn't have to say a word. Judge Beatrice Langston had seen many children come through her courtroom over the years, but there was something about Meg, her stillness, her eyes, the way she barely moved, that lingered with her even after the private meeting had ended. She had thanked the little girl, sent her back to the hallway where a bailiff waited to return her to the courtroom, and sat alone for a few moments. Her mind raced. That bruise. It wasn't large, but it wasn't nothing either. The yellowed edges suggested it was a few days old. The child hadn't fallen at recess or scraped her elbow on a playground fence. It was in a spot that made her hesitate to lift her arm. Back in court, Melissa greeted Meg with a warm smile as she returned to her seat. She gently brushed her daughter's bangs out of her eyes and whispered something only the girl could hear. Meg nodded, her face frozen in that same unreadable expression. Julie, the older daughter, still hadn't spoken a word the entire day. Her face was blank, almost eerily so. The kind of blankness that didn't come naturally to children. It was a silence learned over time. Judge Langston cleared her throat. I've spoken privately with Meg, she said, her voice composed. And while I won't reveal what was said, I'd like to call a brief recess to consider everything presented today. Neither attorney objected. Melissa's expression was unreadable. Paul looked cautiously hopeful. As the judge stood and began to leave the courtroom, she took one last look at the children. That's when it happened. Meg turned her head, just slightly, and looked straight into the judge's eyes. Her gaze didn't last more than 2 seconds. But within that gaze, there was fear. And then, Meg did something so subtle it would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. She blinked 3 times, slowly, deliberately, then tilted her head just an inch and lowered her gaze to the floor. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random movement. It was a signal. The judge knew it immediately. She turned and walked back toward her chambers. The image of that small, silent plea burned into her memory. She didn't need a confession. She didn't need the child to say the words. She had seen enough. Back in chambers. In her office, Judge Langston sat at her desk, fingers steepled under her chin. A legal clerk entered with a stack of files and placed them neatly in front of her. These are the prior visit reports from Child Services, Your Honor. There was one call made by a neighbor almost 10 months ago, but no official case opened. Langston opened the report and skimmed through it. The call had been made anonymously, reporting raised voices, crying, and what sounded like glass breaking. The response was delayed due to workload, and by the time a caseworker followed up, Melissa had answered the door smiling, calm, explaining that one of the girls had broken a cup. No signs of injury. Nothing more came of it. Now, that bruise had a context. Langston opened another folder. School records. Julie's teacher had made a note last semester about withdrawn behavior, often fearful during group activities. It had been flagged, but nothing was formally escalated. It all formed a picture, not sharp, but clear enough. Back in the courtroom, she saw it now. The rehearsed answers, the silence of the children, the control Melissa had over every word and movement. The girls weren't fidgeting because they were trained not to. They weren't speaking because silence was safer. Langston stood, made her decision, and returned to the bench. As everyone stood for the judge's entrance, Paul's breath caught in his throat. Melissa straightened her posture. "I have considered all the evidence," Judge Langston began, "as well as the testimonies, reports, and statements from both parents and others involved." She paused. "It's clear that both parents love their children. That is not in question. However, this court is charged not with weighing emotions, but with ensuring the safety and well-being of the children in question." Melissa kept her expression composed, but her hand began to tremble slightly. After speaking privately with Meg and reviewing previously overlooked materials, the judge continued, "This court finds cause for concern regarding the environment in which the children currently reside." There was a beat of silence. "Effective immediately, full physical custody of Julie and Meg will be awarded to their father, Paul Brackett. Supervised visitation will be arranged for the mother, pending further investigation." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Melissa blinked in disbelief. "No," she whispered. Then louder. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is outrageous." Langston raised a hand calmly. "The decision is final. You may file an appeal, but the children will be removed from your custody today." Julie looked over at her sister. Meg clutched her bear tightly and didn't move. But for the first time in the entire trial, Julie reached out and took her sister's hand. The car ride from the courthouse was long and quiet. Paul didn't push the girls to talk. He didn't know what they were thinking, what they had been through. But he knew one thing: they were finally with him. He had cleaned the apartment thoroughly the night before, hoping they would be there. Clean sheets on both twin beds. Cartoons saved on the TV. A small box of cereal and juice waiting on the counter. It wasn't much, but it was home. When they walked in, Meg immediately went to the couch and curled up under a throw blanket. Julie stood silently in the doorway, scanning the apartment with cautious eyes. Paul knelt beside her. "I know it's small," he said gently, "but you can make it yours." Julie finally looked at him. "Do we have to go back?" Paul's throat tightened. "No. Not if I can help it." That night, Paul cooked pasta. The girls didn't eat much, but they didn't refuse it either. Meg fell asleep on the couch. Julie asked for an extra pillow. He watched them sleep for a long time, then sat on the edge of his bed and wept, quietly, so they wouldn't hear. Let me take a moment to pause this beautiful story and ask you a question. Are you already subscribed to the Curiosidad Global channel? If not, subscribe now. It's completely free, and it helps us keep bringing you more stories like this one. If you're enjoying the story, leave us a like and comment on this video. Your support makes all the difference. Now then, let's continue with the story. Melissa's house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that swallows you whole. She walked through the hallway with a glass of wine, running her hand along the wall where the girls had once taped their drawings. The crayon marks were still faintly visible under the paint. She had scrubbed them off once. Now she missed them. She told herself the judge had made a mistake. That it was temporary. That Paul had manipulated the system. That the girls were confused. But deep down, she felt something else, something heavier. Guilt. Not because she believed she'd done something wrong, but because she knew what the world thought of mothers who lost custody. She felt exposed, judged, weak. That evening, She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through old photos. Birthdays, Halloween costumes, beach trips. All smiles. But now, they looked different. Posed, rehearsed. She couldn't tell if they were real anymore. When her attorney called the next morning, she was ready. "We're filing an appeal," she said flatly. "I want them back. No matter what it takes." Paul didn't sleep much that first night. He woke up every hour, checking on the girls. At one point, he found Meg sitting up in bed, staring at the wall. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. He sat next to her. "Do you want to talk?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Will Mommy be mad?" Paul's chest tightened. He didn't want to speak badly of Melissa. But he couldn't lie either. "No one's going to hurt you," he said. "Not anymore." Meg nodded slowly, then leaned against his arm. It was the first physical affection she had given him since the custody battle began. The next morning, he made pancakes. Julie stayed in her room, but Meg came out and helped set the table. Later that day, Paul took them to the park. Julie remained quiet but followed. Meg ran to the swings. She laughed for the first time, just a little. A woman nearby noticed and smiled. "Your daughters." Paul nodded. "They're beautiful." "Thank you," he said, his voice nearly cracking. They were beginning again. Slowly. But they were free. Julie was the one Paul worried about the most. Unlike Meg, who had begun to open up bit by bit, smiling at cartoons, reaching for his hand when they crossed the street, Julie remained withdrawn. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She simply watched everything. Paul tried talking to her one night after Meg had gone to bed. "I know it's all new here, and maybe weird, but you can talk to me about anything." Julie looked up from her book. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Did you ever hit Mommy?" Paul blinked. "No. Never." "She said you did." Paul sat beside her on the bed, careful to keep space between them. "Julie, I didn't hurt your mother. But I did leave. And I'm sorry you had to go through all of this." Julie didn't say anything. But she closed her book and set it on the nightstand. Then she lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin. Before Paul turned off the light, she whispered. Sometimes, she got really angry. It wasn't a confession. But it was a beginning. The letter came in a plain white envelope. Paul had been expecting it, but still, his hands trembled as he opened it. Melissa had filed an official appeal, accusing Judge Langston of bias and requesting a retrial based on unlawful influence during private chambers. His attorney called minutes later. "She's trying to get a new trial. Possibly a new judge. Can she win?" Paul asked. "There's a chance. The appeal is procedural. If they argue that Judge Langston made her decision based on a private conversation with a minor, it could lead to a new hearing. Especially if the reviewing judge is more lenient." Paul felt sick. That night, he didn't sleep. He watched the girls sleep, watched the small, peaceful rise and fall of their chests. He had fought so hard to get them back. The thought of losing them again paralyzed him. But he wasn't the same man he had been a year ago. He wouldn't freeze. He wouldn't back down. He would fight again. And this time, he wouldn't fight alone. The appeal landed on the desk of Judge Caleb Delaney, a relatively new appointee to the family court bench. He was in his 40s, known for his clean-cut image and by-the-book rulings. Melissa's legal team jumped at the opportunity. Their argument was polished, that the original judge's decision had relied too heavily on an unverified private meeting with a 5-year-old girl. That the bruise could have been from school or play. That no mandatory report had been filed by any teacher or doctor. That Paul had poisoned the children against their mother. Delaney listened carefully. He didn't smile. He didn't react. Paul's attorney responded firmly, presenting the pattern of behavior, missed visitation, school records noting emotional detachment, and the quiet evidence that had spoken louder than any testimony, the signal from Meg. But the appeal wasn't about facts. It was about process. Judge Delaney looked over the paperwork, then glanced up. I'm not here to re-examine the original ruling. I'm here to determine whether the ruling was reached properly. Paul's stomach dropped. This was going to be close. Then Delaney surprised them. I will allow one in-camera interview with Julie. Gasps filled the room. If Julie agreed to speak, it could change everything. The courtroom cleared. Now, it was up to her. Julie sat in the private chambers of Judge Caleb Delaney, her legs swinging slightly off the edge of the chair. She wore a navy cardigan and clutched a pencil between her fingers, even though she wasn't writing. Delaney looked at her gently over his glasses. I know this isn't easy, he said. I just want to ask you a few questions. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to. Julie nodded, not speaking yet. Do you know why you're here? She gave a small shrug. Because Mommy's trying to get us back. Yes, he said carefully. And we want to make sure everyone is safe and taken care of. That's all. Julie took a deep breath. She didn't fidget or cry. She just sat there with eyes too old for her age. Mommy used to say we couldn't tell anyone what happened at home. Delaney leaned forward slightly. What kinds of things happened? She got mad a lot. If Meg cried, she'd yell at her. Sometimes she'd throw things. Once, she grabbed my arm and left a bruise. I told my teacher I fell. Why did you say that? Because Mommy said if I told the truth, I'd go live with strangers and never see her again. Delaney's hand paused on his notepad. Julie looked at him squarely. But I don't want to lie anymore. Judge Delaney thanked Julie, then dismissed her gently. Once she left the room with a counselor, he sat still for a moment, letting her words settle in. Later that afternoon, the courtroom reconvened. Melissa was poised and polished again. Her hair neat, her makeup flawless. But there was a flicker in her eyes, like she could feel something was slipping out of her control. Delaney cleared his throat. After reviewing the procedural concerns and conducting a private interview with one of the children, I've reached a decision. Melissa's attorney sat straighter, prepared to counter. While the original judge's methods may not align with standard protocol, the substance of her concern appears not only valid, but now corroborated. A ripple moved through the courtroom. In light of the new testimony and the prior documentation, I see no cause to reverse the initial custody decision. Paul exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. Custody will remain with Mr. Brackett. Visitation rights for Ms. Holloway will remain suspended pending further evaluation. Melissa stood up abruptly. You can't do this. They're my daughters. Delaney remained firm. This hearing is concluded. You may file for review in 6 months. The gavel struck. Paul turned to his attorney in disbelief. It was over. Melissa sat alone on her porch, her attorney gone, her phone silent. She didn't cry, not yet. She stared at the horizon, where the trees swayed gently. The same backyard where Julie used to play with sidewalk chalk. The same porch where Meg would beg for popsicles on hot afternoons. And now, the silence was final. In the weeks that followed, she sent emails. Long, emotional messages to Paul. Some apologizing. Some angry. Some begging for a second chance. Paul didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the girls. Therapy sessions began quietly. Julie was more open than expected. Meg took time. But both slowly started healing. One evening, while they were baking cookies, Julie turned to her dad. Do you think she'll ever get better? Paul paused. I don't know. I hope so. Julie nodded, placing the dough on the tray. I still miss her, she said softly. But I don't want to go back. He placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to. Outside, Meg laughed as Max chased his tail. And for the first time in a long time, home felt real. Melissa started writing letters to her daughters. They began as drafts in her journal, then moved to carefully written pages on monogrammed stationery. She never mailed them. Maybe she knew Paul wouldn't deliver them. Maybe she wasn't ready. The letters were full of memories, first days of school, lost teeth, favorite bedtime songs. She wrote about the pancakes Julie used to love, how Meg would always hold her pinky finger instead of her hand. But as the pages filled, her tone shifted. She began reflecting, acknowledging the moments she couldn't deny. I know you were scared sometimes. I know I yelled too much. I thought I was doing what I had to do to keep everything together. She kept those letters in a box on her nightstand. It was the only part of the house that still felt alive. One day, she sealed one in an envelope and left it on the front porch. She didn't know if anyone would come to get it, but part of her hoped someone would. Life for Paul and the girls started to settle. Meg had taken up painting. Every Sunday, she covered the coffee table with paper, watercolors, and crayons. She often drew 3 houses, one with a sad cloud, one with a rainbow, and one that floated in the sky. Paul never asked what they meant. He just admired them all. Julie made a friend in school. Her name was Tessa. They started doing homework together, then sleepovers. Paul watched her laugh again, really laugh, and it undid him. One afternoon, after school, Julie sat beside her dad on the porch. "Mom wrote a letter," she said. Paul looked over, surprised. "Did you read it?" She nodded. "It's sad." "What did it say?" "She said she misses us. That she knows she made mistakes." Paul didn't push further. "She didn't blame anyone," Julie added. "That's new." Paul placed an arm around her. "You don't have to forgive her now. Or ever. That's your choice." Julie looked out at the fading sun. "I don't hate her," she said. "I just feel better when she's not yelling." That was all she needed to say. 6 months later, Melissa filed for visitation. Supervised, short sessions at a neutral location. Paul didn't fight it. When the day came, the girls were nervous. Julie packed a notebook. Meg brought her bear. Paul dropped them off at the community center and waited in the car outside. The session lasted exactly 1 hour. Melissa had dressed simply. No makeup, no polished smile. Just her and the girls, sitting at a round table with a counselor nearby. She didn't ask them to love her. She didn't try to explain away the past. She simply asked them how they were doing. Julie answered. Meg didn't. But when the session ended and the girls walked back to the car, Julie turned once, just for a moment, and waved. Melissa smiled, even if it was through tears. Back at home, Paul served dinner. Julie told Meg she was brave. That night, Paul tucked them both in, as always. As he turned out the light, Julie whispered, "Thank you for seeing what no one else did." He didn't answer. He just kissed her forehead, closed the door, and let peace settle over the home they had fought so hard to build. The end.